The galaxy was never a safe place, but today, it felt darker than ever. The bustling spaceport was alive with the hum of engines, the chatter of traders, and the clatter of cargo being loaded onto ships. Among the crowd, a young woman moved with purpose. She was not just any traveler, she was the daughter of the most dangerous man in the galaxy. Her name didn't matter, her lineage did. She knew the risks of being his child, but she had always been careful. Today, however, careful wasn't enough. It happened in a blur. A group of masked figures emerged from the shadows, their movements swift and precise. Before anyone could react, they surrounded her. She tried to fight back, but they were too many, too fast. One of them pressed a device to her neck, and her vision blurred. The last thing she heard was a voice, cold and mechanical, saying, "Tell your father this is just the beginning." Then, everything went black. The crowd stood frozen, too shocked to intervene. By the time anyone thought to call for help, the kidnappers were gone, leaving no trace behind. The spaceport, once a place of life and energy, now felt eerily silent. Far away, on a distant planet, a man received a message. It was short, just a few words, but it was enough to make his blood run cold. "We have your daughter. Don't interfere, or she dies." The man didn't need to read the message twice. He knew who he was dealing with. He also knew one thing for certain: they had made a grave mistake. He was not just any father. He was a legend, a man who had faced armies and won, a man who had earned the title of the deadliest human in the galaxy. And now, they had taken the one person he loved more than anything. As he stood there, his fists clenched, his mind raced. He thought of his daughter, her smile, her courage, her determination. She was strong, but no one was strong enough to face what was coming alone. He took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing with resolve. They had taken her, but they had no idea what they had unleashed. The hunt was on. The man stood alone in his quarters, the weight of the galaxy pressing down on his shoulders. The message still burned in his mind, each word a dagger to his heart. He had faced countless enemies, survived impossible odds, but this was different. This was personal. He walked to a small, hidden compartment in the wall. Inside was a holographic projector. With a flick of his hand, it activated, and the room filled with images from his past. He had not always been the most feared man in the galaxy. Once, he was just a boy, growing up on a war-torn planet. His childhood had been stolen by conflict, his family torn apart by greed and power. He learned early that the galaxy was a cruel place, and survival meant being crueler. The images shifted, showing him as a young man, joining the military. He was a natural leader, his tactical mind and unyielding determination setting him apart. But it wasn't just skill that made him rise through the ranks, it was his willingness to do what others wouldn't. He made tough decisions, sacrifices that haunted him to this day. One image lingered longer than the others, a battlefield, littered with the wreckage of ships and the bodies of the fallen. It was a turning point in his life, the moment he became a legend. Outnumbered and outgunned, he had led his team to victory against impossible odds. But the cost was high. Many of his comrades didn't make it back, and their faces still visited him in his dreams. The hologram shifted again, this time to a happier memory. His daughter, as a child, laughing as she ran through a field of starship flowers. She had been his light in the darkness, the one thing that kept him grounded. When she was born, he vowed to protect her, to give her a life free from the horrors he had known. But the galaxy had other plans. As his reputation grew, so did his enemies. They couldn't defeat him in battle, so they targeted what he loved most. His wife had been the first victim, killed in an ambush meant for him. He had sworn then that he would never let anyone else he loved suffer because of him. And yet, here he was. He deactivated the hologram and sat down, his mind racing. He knew who had taken his daughter. The syndicate was powerful, ruthless, and cunning. They had been a thorn in his side for years, but he had always managed to stay one step ahead. This time, they had struck where it hurt most. But they had underestimated him. He stood up, his resolve hardening. He had spent his life fighting battles, but this was the one that mattered most. He would tear the galaxy apart if that's what it took to bring her back. He activated his communicator, sending a coded message to his most trusted allies. They would need every resource, every connection, every favor owed. The syndicate had made their move, and now it was his turn. As he prepared for the journey ahead, one thought kept him going: his daughter was strong, but no one should have to face the darkness alone. And he would not rest until she was safe. The galaxy was vast, but the father knew every corner of it. He had spent years building a network of allies, informants, and safehouses. Now, that network would be put to the test. His first stop was a remote outpost on the edge of known space. It was a place where the law didn't reach, where deals were made in shadows and secrets were traded like currency. He needed information, and he knew just who to ask. The outpost was a chaotic mess of alien species, traitors, and mercenaries. The air was thick with the smell of fuel and sweat, and the sound of clinking glasses and hushed conversations filled the room. He moved through the crowd like a shadow, his presence unnoticed until he reached a corner table. There, sitting alone, was an old friend, or at least, as close to a friend as someone like him could have. The man was a former smuggler, now retired, but still well-connected. "I need your help," the father said, his voice low but firm. The smuggler looked up, his eyes narrowing. "You're the last person I expected to see here. What trouble are you in now?" "They took my daughter." The smuggler's expression changed instantly. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Who?" "The syndicate." The smuggler let out a low whistle. "You're playing with fire. Those people don't mess around." "I don't care. I need to find her." The smuggler hesitated, then nodded. "I'll see what I can do. But it won't be cheap. I'll pay whatever it takes." The smuggler disappeared into the crowd, leaving the father alone with his thoughts. He knew time was running out. Every second his daughter was in the syndicate's hands was a second too long. Hours passed before the smuggler returned, a data chip in his hand. "This is everything I could find. They've been moving her from planet to planet, trying to throw anyone off their trail. But there's a pattern. They're heading toward the outer rim." The father took the chip, his mind already racing. The outer rim was a lawless place, perfect for hiding someone. But it was also dangerous, even for someone like him. "Thank you," he said, standing up. The smuggler grabbed his arm. "Be careful. The syndicate isn't your only problem. There are rumors, something big is coming." The father nodded, but his mind was already elsewhere. He had a lead, and that was all he needed. As he left the outpost, he activated the data chip. It contained coordinates, names, and a map of the syndicate's movements. They were careful, but not careful enough. He would find them. The journey to the outer rim was long and treacherous. He traveled alone, avoiding detection as much as possible. Along the way, he encountered old enemies and uneasy allies, each with their own agenda. But he didn't have time for distractions. His only focus was his daughter. Finally, he reached a small, desolate planet on the edge of the galaxy. According to the data, this was where the syndicate had last been seen. The planet was barren, its surface scarred by ancient wars. It was the perfect place to hide. As he landed his ship, he felt a familiar tension in the air. He was being watched. He stepped out, his senses on high alert. The landscape was empty, but he knew better than to trust appearances. He moved cautiously, his hand resting on the weapon at his side. Then, he saw it, a faint trail of footprints leading to a hidden entrance in the rocks. He followed it, his heart pounding with every step. Inside, he found a makeshift base, filled with supplies and equipment. But there was no sign of his daughter. Before he could search further, a voice echoed through the cavern. "I was wondering how long it would take you to find us." He turned, his weapon drawn, and came face to face with a syndicate operative. The man was tall, his face hidden behind a mask, but his voice was cold and mocking. "Where is she?" the father demanded. The operative smirked. "You're too late. She's already gone." The father's grip tightened on his weapon. "You're lying." The operative shrugged. "Believe what you want. But if you want to see her again, you'll have to go through us." The father didn't hesitate. He fired, the shot echoing through the cavern. The operative dodged, returning fire as the base erupted into chaos. The fight was intense, but the father's training and experience gave him the edge. He moved with precision, taking down one enemy after another. But he knew this was just the beginning. As the last operative fell, the father stood amidst the wreckage, his breath heavy. He had won this battle, but the war was far from over. He looked at the data chip again, his determination unwavering. They had taken his daughter, but they had no idea what they had unleashed. The chase was on. The room was cold, dark, and silent. The daughter sat on the floor, her back against the wall, her mind racing. She had been here for what felt like days, though it was hard to tell without any windows or clocks. The only light came from a faint glow in the ceiling, casting eerie shadows on the walls. She had been kidnapped before, but never like this. These people were different, more organized, more ruthless. They didn't speak to her, didn't explain why she was here. They just left her alone, waiting for something. But she wasn't the type to wait. She stood up, her legs stiff from sitting too long, and began to examine the room. It was small, with no obvious exits, but she knew there had to be a way out. She had spent her life learning from her father, and if there was one thing he had taught her, it was to never give up. She started with the walls, running her hands along the smooth surface, feeling for any cracks or seams. Nothing. Next, she checked the floor, pressing on each tile to see if any were loose. Still nothing. Frustrated but determined, she turned her attention to the ceiling. The glow was coming from a small panel, just out of reach. She jumped, trying to grab it, but it was too high. Then, she had an idea. She took off her jacket and tied it around her waist, creating a makeshift rope. She tied one end to her shoe and threw it at the panel, hoping to pull it down. It took several tries, but finally, the panel shifted, and a small object fell to the floor. It was a keycard. She picked it up, her heart pounding. This was her chance. She moved to the door, holding the keycard up to the scanner. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft beep, the door slid open. She stepped into the hallway, her senses on high alert. The corridor was dimly lit, with doors on either side. She didn't know where she was or where to go, but she knew she had to keep moving. As she walked, she heard voices. She pressed herself against the wall, holding her breath as two guards passed by. They were talking about a shipment, something about moving her to another location. She waited until they were gone, then continued down the hallway. She needed to find a way out, but she also needed to know what they were planning. If they were moving her, it meant her father was getting closer. She found a control room at the end of the hallway. The door was slightly ajar, and she could see a monitor inside, displaying a map of the facility. She slipped inside, her eyes scanning the screen. The facility was huge, with multiple levels and exits. But one area caught her attention, a hangar bay, where a ship was being prepared. If she could get there, she could escape. But first, she needed a distraction. She looked around the room, her eyes landing on a control panel. She didn't know much about technology, but she knew enough to cause some chaos. She pressed a few buttons, and the lights in the hallway flickered. Alarms began to blare, and she heard shouts as the guards scrambled to figure out what was happening. She smiled to herself and slipped out of the room, heading toward the hangar bay. The journey was tense. She had to avoid guards, navigate through unfamiliar corridors, and stay one step ahead of the chaos she had created. But she was determined. She had to make it. Finally, she reached the hangar bay. The ship was there, its engines humming as it prepared for takeoff. She just needed to get on board. But as she approached, a voice stopped her in her tracks. Going somewhere? She turned to see a man standing behind her, his arms crossed and a smirk on his face. He was tall, with a scar running down his cheek, and he looked like he had been waiting for her. She didn't answer. Instead, she lunged at him, using all the training her father had given her. The fight was intense, but she held her own, landing a few solid hits before he managed to grab her. "You're just like your father," he said, his grip tightening. "But you're not getting away that easily." She struggled, but it was no use. He was too strong. As he dragged her back toward the facility, she felt a wave of despair. She had been so close. But then, she heard something, a faint sound, like footsteps. She looked up and saw a figure moving in the shadows. Her father. The man with the scar tightened his grip on the daughter's arm, dragging her back into the facility. She struggled, but his strength was overwhelming. Her mind raced, searching for a way out, but before she could act, a voice cut through the chaos. "Let her go." The man froze, his smirk fading as he turned to face the source of the voice. The father stood in the shadows, his weapon drawn and his eyes burning with fury. "You're too late," the man said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "She's already ours." The father stepped into the light, his expression cold and unyielding. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." The man laughed, but it was a nervous laugh, one that betrayed his fear. "Oh, we know exactly who you are. That's why we took her. You're the key to everything." The daughter's eyes widened. "What are you talking about?" The man ignored her, his focus entirely on the father. "You've been a thorn in our side for years. But now, you're going to help us. Whether you like it or not." The father's grip on his weapon tightened. "I don't work for scum like you." "You will," the man said, his tone darkening. "Because if you don't, she dies." The daughter felt a chill run down her spine. She had always known her father's enemies were dangerous, but this was different. This was personal. The father didn't flinch. "You think you can threaten me? You think you can win?" The man smirked. "We already have." Before the father could respond, a group of syndicate operatives emerged from the shadows, their weapons trained on him. The man with the scar stepped back, dragging the daughter with him. "You have a choice," the man said. "Help us, or watch her suffer." The father's eyes flicked to his daughter, his expression softening for just a moment. Then, he lowered his weapon. "What do you want?" The man's smirk widened. "That's more like it." He gestured to one of the operatives, who handed the father a data pad. On it was a detailed plan, a mission that would require the father's unique skills. The daughter strained to see what was on the screen, but the man pulled her back. "Don't worry, you'll find out soon enough." The father's jaw tightened as he read the details. The mission was dangerous, nearly impossible, but it wasn't the difficulty that worried him. It was the consequences. "If I do this," he said, his voice low, "you let her go." The man shook his head. "Not until it's done. But if you succeed, we'll consider it." The daughter's heart sank. She knew her father would do anything to protect her, but this was too much. "Don't do it," she said, her voice trembling. "They'll never let me go." The father looked at her, his eyes filled with pain and determination. I don't have a choice. The man with the scar laughed. Smart move. Now, let's get to work. As the operatives led the father away, the daughter felt a wave of despair. She had always admired her father's strength, but now, she felt the weight of his sacrifices. The man with the scar leaned closer, his breath hot on her ear. Don't worry, little girl. You're going to be just fine. As long as your father does what he's told. She glared at him, her fear replaced by anger. You're making a mistake. He'll never let you win. The man smirked. We'll see about that. As he dragged her back to her cell, the daughter's mind raced. She had to find a way to stop this, to warn her father, to escape. But for now, all she could do was wait. And hope. The father stood in the syndicate's war room, surrounded by operatives who watched his every move. The mission they had given him was clear: infiltrate a heavily fortified military base, retrieve a classified weapon, and deliver it to them. It was a suicide mission, designed to test his loyalty, or get him killed. But the father had no intention of playing by their rules. As he studied the schematics of the base, his mind worked furiously. He knew the syndicate was watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. But he also knew they underestimated him. They thought they had him cornered, but they didn't realize he had been in worse situations before. He turned to the man with the scar, who was leaning against the wall with a smug expression. I'll need equipment, the father said. And a team. The man raised an eyebrow. A team? You think we're going to trust you with our people? The father shrugged. You want this done, don't you? I can't do it alone. The man hesitated, then nodded. Fine. But if you try anything, your daughter pays the price. The father's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He knew the stakes. An hour later, he was aboard a syndicate ship, heading toward the military base. The team they had given him was small, just 3 operatives, all of whom clearly didn't trust him. But that didn't matter. He had his own plan. As the ship approached the base, the father briefed the team. We'll go in through the ventilation system. It's the least guarded entry point. Once inside, we split up. I'll retrieve the weapon, you 3 create a distraction. The operatives exchanged glances but didn't argue. They knew their orders. The infiltration began smoothly. The father led the way, his movements precise and calculated. He had done this countless times before, and it showed. The operatives followed, their tension palpable. But as they reached the heart of the base, things started to go wrong. An alarm blared, and the corridors filled with soldiers. The father cursed under his breath. Someone had tipped them off. We need to move, one of the operatives shouted, panic in his voice. The father didn't respond. Instead, he grabbed the operative's arm and pulled him into a side room. Stay here, he ordered. I'll handle this. Before the operative could argue, the father was gone, slipping through the chaos like a ghost. He moved quickly, avoiding the soldiers and making his way to the weapon's location. The syndicate had given him detailed instructions, but he had no intention of following them. Instead, he planted a small device on the weapon, one that would render it useless. As he worked, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned, his weapon drawn, but it wasn't a soldier. It was one of the syndicate operatives. What are you doing? The operative demanded, his eyes narrowing. The father didn't hesitate. He fired, the shot hitting the operative in the shoulder. The man fell to the ground, clutching his wound. You're betraying us, the operative gasped. The father knelt beside him, his expression cold. You should have known better than to trust me. He stood up and activated the device, watching as the weapon's lights flickered and died. The syndicate's plan was ruined. But he wasn't done yet. He made his way back to the ship, where the remaining operatives were waiting. They looked at him with suspicion, but he didn't give them time to react. "We need to leave," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Now." The operatives hesitated, then nodded. They knew better than to argue. As the ship took off, the father looked out the window, his mind already racing. He had outsmarted the syndicate, but the fight was far from over. He had a daughter to save. The syndicate's base was a fortress, hidden deep within an asteroid belt. The father stood at the edge of the docking bay, his eyes scanning the area. He had come alone, knowing that this was the only way to end things. The man with the scar was waiting for him, his arms crossed and a smirk on his face. "I have to admit, I'm impressed. You actually made it back." The father didn't respond. He stepped off the ship, his weapon at his side but not drawn. He knew this wasn't a fight he could win with brute force. "Where's my daughter?" he demanded, his voice low and steady. The man's smirk widened. "Safe. For now. But if you want to see her again, you'll have to come with me." The father followed him through the base, his senses on high alert. The corridors were lined with armed guards, their weapons trained on him. He knew he was walking into a trap, but he didn't have a choice. Finally, they reached a large, dimly lit room. In the center stood the syndicate leader, a tall, imposing figure with cold, calculating eyes. Beside him was the daughter, her hands bound and a look of defiance on her face. "Father," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. The father's heart ached at the sight of her, but he kept his expression neutral. He couldn't afford to show weakness. The syndicate leader stepped forward, his voice echoing through the room. "You've caused us a lot of trouble. But now, it's time to end this." The father met his gaze, his eyes burning with determination. "Let her go. This is between you and me." The leader laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Oh, it's far more than that. You see, you're not just a thorn in our side, you're a symbol. And symbols need to be destroyed." The father's grip tightened on his weapon. "If you want a fight, you've got one." The leader's smile faded, replaced by a look of pure malice. "Very well." He gestured to the guards, who moved in, their weapons raised. The father didn't hesitate. He fired, taking down 2 guards before they could react. The room erupted into chaos. The daughter watched in horror as her father fought, his movements swift and precise. He was outnumbered, but he didn't back down. She knew she had to do something. As the fight raged on, she noticed something, a control panel on the wall, just out of reach. If she could get to it, she might be able to disable the security systems and give her father a chance. She struggled against her bonds, her mind racing. Then, she remembered something her father had taught her: always look for an opportunity. With a burst of strength, she kicked out, knocking over a nearby guard. The man with the scar turned, his eyes narrowing. "Stay still," he growled, moving toward her. But she wasn't about to give up. She rolled to the side, grabbing a piece of broken metal from the floor. With a quick motion, she cut through her bonds and sprang to her feet. The man with the scar lunged at her, but she was ready. She dodged his attack and slammed the metal into his side. He stumbled, giving her the opening she needed. She ran to the control panel, her fingers flying over the buttons. The lights flickered, and the security systems shut down. The father noticed immediately. He took advantage of the confusion, taking down the remaining guards with ease. The syndicate leader watched in disbelief as his plan fell apart. He drew his weapon, aiming it at the father. "This isn't over," he snarled. But before he could fire, the daughter stepped in front of him, her eyes blazing with defiance. "You're wrong," she said. "It's already over." The leader hesitated, his confidence wavering. In that moment, the father struck, disarming him and pinning him to the ground. The room fell silent, the only sound the heavy breathing of the father and daughter. They stood together, victorious but exhausted. The father looked at his daughter, his expression filled with pride. "You did well." She smiled, tears in her eyes. "I learned from the best." As they prepared to leave, the father turned to the syndicate leader, who was now unconscious. "This isn't the end," he said quietly. "But it's a start." With that, they left the base, ready to face whatever came next. The ship hummed softly as it drifted through the void of space, its course set for a remote safehouse. Inside, the father and daughter sat in silence, the weight of everything they had been through pressing down on them. The daughter stared out the window, her mind replaying the events of the past few days. She had always known her father was a legend, but seeing him in action had been something else entirely. He had fought with a ferocity and determination that left her in awe. But it had also scared her. "Are you okay?" the father asked, breaking the silence. She turned to look at him, her expression a mix of emotions. "I don't know. I mean, I'm glad we're safe, but it's a lot to process." He nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. "I know. But you were incredible back there. You saved us." She smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I just did what I had to do. Like you taught me." The father reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I'm proud of you. More than you know." She looked at him, tears welling up in her eyes. "I was so scared, Dad. I thought I was going to lose you." He pulled her into a hug, his own emotions threatening to surface. "You'll never lose me. Not as long as I'm breathing." They sat like that for a while, drawing strength from each other. But the peace was short-lived. The ship's console beeped, signaling an incoming transmission. The father reluctantly let go of his daughter and moved to check it. The screen flickered to life, revealing a familiar face, the syndicate leader. He was bruised and battered, but his eyes burned with hatred. "You think you've won?" he spat. "This isn't over. Not by a long shot." The father's expression hardened. "You're finished. Your base is destroyed, your people are scattered. You have nothing left." The leader smirked, a chilling sight. "You're wrong. We have something you care about. Something you'll do anything to protect." The daughter's heart sank. What is he talking about? The leader's gaze shifted to her, his smirk widening. "You'll find out soon enough." The transmission ended, leaving the father and daughter in stunned silence. "What does he mean?" the daughter asked, her voice trembling. The father sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. But we'll figure it out. Together." As the ship continued its journey, the father couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in his chest. He had thought the fight was over, but it seemed the syndicate had one last card to play. The safehouse was a small, hidden outpost on a barren moon. It was a place they had used before, a place where they could regroup and plan their next move. But as they landed, the father noticed something was off. The outpost was too quiet, too still. "Stay close," he said, his hand on his weapon as they stepped out of the ship. The outpost was empty, the signs of a struggle evident. Furniture was overturned, equipment was smashed, and there was a faint smell of smoke in the air. "What happened here?" the daughter whispered, her eyes wide with fear. The father didn't answer. He moved through the outpost, his senses on high alert. Then, he saw it, a message scrawled on the wall in bold, red letters. "You can't run forever." The daughter gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "What do we do now?" The father's jaw tightened, his mind racing. "We fight. But this time, we do it on our terms." He turned to her, his expression filled with determination. "We're not running anymore. We're going to end this, once and for all." She nodded, her fear replaced by resolve. Together. As they prepared for the final confrontation, the father couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. His daughter had grown so much, faced so much, and yet she was still standing. But he also knew the hardest part was yet to come. The father and daughter stood at the edge of the Syndicate's final stronghold, a massive fortress hidden deep within an uncharted nebula. The air was thick with tension, the weight of everything they had been through pressing down on them. "This is it," the father said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "We end this today." The daughter nodded, her eyes fixed on the fortress. Together. They moved quickly and quietly, using every skill they had learned to avoid detection. The fortress was heavily guarded, but they had faced worse. As they approached the main entrance, the father turned to his daughter. "Remember, stay close and trust your instincts. No matter what happens, we're in this together." She smiled faintly, her determination shining through. "I'm ready." The infiltration was swift and precise. They took down guards, disabled security systems, and moved deeper into the fortress. But as they reached the central chamber, they were met with a sight that stopped them in their tracks. The syndicate leader stood at the center of the room, surrounded by his most loyal operatives. In his hand was a remote, his finger hovering over a button. "I knew you'd come," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "But you're too late." The father stepped forward, his weapon raised. "Let her go. This ends now." The leader laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "Oh, it's already over. You see, this fortress is rigged to explode. And if I press this button, it all goes up in flames." The daughter's heart raced, but she forced herself to stay calm. She knew they couldn't afford to panic. "What do you want?" the father demanded, his eyes never leaving the leader. The leader smirked. "I want you to suffer. To know that no matter how hard you fight, you can't win." The father's grip tightened on his weapon. "You're wrong. We've already won. You've lost everything." The leader's smirk faded, replaced by a look of pure hatred. "Then we'll all go down together." He pressed the button, and the fortress began to shake. Alarms blared, and the lights flickered as the self-destruct sequence activated. The father didn't hesitate. He fired, taking down the leader and his operatives in a matter of seconds. But the damage was done. "We need to go," the daughter shouted, her voice barely audible over the alarms. The father grabbed her hand, and they ran, their hearts pounding as the fortress crumbled around them. The corridors were filled with smoke and debris, but they didn't stop. Finally, they reached the exit, the ship just ahead. But as they climbed aboard, the daughter noticed something, a group of prisoners, trapped in a nearby cell. "We can't leave them," she said, her eyes filled with desperation. The father hesitated, then nodded. "Go. I'll get them." He ran back into the fortress, his movements swift and determined. The daughter watched, her heart in her throat, as he freed the prisoners and led them to safety. As the last prisoner climbed aboard, the father turned to his daughter. "Let's go." The ship took off just as the fortress exploded, a massive fireball lighting up the nebula. They watched in silence as the Syndicate's stronghold was reduced to ash. The daughter turned to her father, tears in her eyes. "You saved them." He smiled faintly, his expression filled with pride. "We saved them. Together." As the ship drifted through the stars, the father and daughter sat in silence, the weight of everything they had been through finally lifting. "What now?" the daughter asked, her voice soft. The father looked at her, his eyes filled with love and determination. "Now, we live. We've faced the darkness and come out stronger. And no matter what comes next, we'll face it together." She smiled, her heart filled with hope. "I like the sound of that." As they looked out at the stars, the father spoke again, his voice filled with wisdom. "No matter how dark the galaxy gets, love and courage will always light the way. The daughter nodded, her resolve stronger than ever. And we'll always have each other. With that, they set a course for home, ready to face whatever the future held. Conclusion. This concludes the story of They Abducted the Daughter of the Galaxy's Most Dangerous Man. It's a tale of love, courage, and resilience, with a heartfelt lesson about the power of family and the strength to overcome even the darkest challenges. Let me know if you'd like any adjustments or additional details.